They said she wasn't worth much, just another heavy-set girl who'd brought shame on her family. But what kind of world trades a daughter for a dying horse? And what kind of man takes that deal and treats her not as property, but as a person? In the Dakota Territory, 1889. The wind carried more judgment than mercy. It whistled through the market stalls, through the broken fences, through the hearts of people who'd forgotten what grace looked like. And in that dust-bitten town called Rust Creek, a young woman named Clara Mayfield found herself sold belly round with child, eyes downcast, future uncertain, but sometimes the cruelest trades give birth to the gentlest miracles. Sometimes redemption comes wearing a cowboy's hat and silence for armor. Who was Elias Boone, the man who took her away into the wild plains? What kind of love could grow between two people so wounded by the world? And could a woman once traded like livestock ever build a life that felt like home, settle in, friend? The fire's warm, and this story runs deep. If it touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story that the West forgot to tell. Rust Creek, Dakota Territory, autumn, 1884. The morning wind came down from the hills, sharp enough to draw tears, carrying dust that stuck to the tongue like ash. The kind of wind that scraped paint from signs and hope from faces. Clara Mayfield walked behind her mother, boots slipping on the frost-hardened dirt. Her breath puffed white, quick and shallow. She was 22, soft-bodied, heavy in the way life itself can make a woman heavy. 6 months along. Her stomach a round weight beneath a faded blue dress that had long since given up trying to fit. Her mother's hand clamped around her wrist tight, punishing, a reminder of every mistake that had brought them here. Agnes Mayfield moved like a woman late for judgment. Her hat string whipped her cheek, but she never slowed. They turned the corner onto the market road. Rust Creek was little more than a dozen buildings, the saloon, a feed store, 2 boarding houses, and a livestock yard that smelled of iron and animal heat. Wagons lined the main street, wheels creaking, horses snorting steam into the cold. Conversation dimmed as the 2 women passed. Lord have mercy. Someone whispered near the well. That Mayfield girl, carrying sin, 6 months, maybe 7. Her poor mama. The words stuck to Clara's back like burrs. She kept her eyes low, counting the cracks in the frozen mud. Her chest burned from shame and the cold, both. Agnes did not glance around. She'd learned to ignore pity. It was just another form of gossip. She marched straight toward the livestock yard, skirts snapping like sails. At the far end of the yard, near the rail fence, a man waited. He was tall, at least 6'4", with shoulders like a barn beam. His coat was rough canvas, dust-stained, sleeves rolled to the forearms, a shadow from his hat brim cut across his face, leaving only the edge of a beard and a mouth set firm. Elias Boone. Clara had heard of him. Everyone had. The silent cowboy, out by the West Creek, the one who never came to town unless he had to. Folks said he'd once run cattle for the army and lost half his herd in a blizzard. Since then, he worked alone, spoke little, prayed less. Agnes stopped a few paces from him, her grip loosening just enough to let Clara stumble to a halt beside her. "You Elias Boone?" she asked. He gave a single nod. Agnes's mouth tightened. "You said you'd take her?" The man looked past her, eyes steady, unreadable. His gaze flicked once toward Clara, then back to her mother. Agnes continued, voice hard. "You'll find her no trouble if you keep her busy. She eats more than she ought and cries more than's decent. But she's got 2 hands and a pulse. That's worth something." Clara's throat closed. She tried to speak, to ask where she was going or why her mother's voice sounded like selling instead of saving, but the words tangled. Agnes gestured to a ranch hand behind her. "You'll get the horse, like we agreed." The man led forward, a bay mare, old and thin, one leg dragging slightly. Its eyes were dull, mane knotted with burrs. The kind of horse you couldn't give away. Elias studied the animal for a long moment, then his gaze returned to Clara. "She got a name?" he asked, voice low, rough as gravel, but not unkind. "Clara Mayfield." Agnes said, 22. Foolish enough to let herself get ruined. But she can work if you push her. And she's yours now. A fair trade. A fair trade, he repeated softly, though whether he meant it or mocked it, Clara couldn't tell. Agnes folded her arms. "Well, you want her or not?" Elias exhaled slow, the sound almost a sigh. "She'll ride with me," he said at last. "That's it?" Agnes asked. "No questions, no sermon." He shook his head once. Agnes gave a sharp, humorless laugh. "Well, you got your horse, mister. Guess that's more than I ever got out of her." She turned to Clara. "You thank the man. He's the only soul fool enough to take you." Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. Agnes's voice rose. "Say it." "Thank you," Clara whispered, eyes fixed on the dirt. Elias didn't respond. He only stepped aside, pointing toward the wagon, hitched to a pair of gray mules. "Get in," he said quietly. Agnes straightened her shawl. "At least now you're worth something." Then she turned and walked away, boots crunching over frozen ground. She never looked back. The market noise returned, cautious at first, then louder as though the moment had been swallowed by ordinary life. A child cried. A pig squealed. Somewhere, a door slammed. Clara stood alone beside the wagon, the world spinning slow and cruel around her. Elias took the reins, climbed onto the driver's bench, and waited. "Come on," he said. She climbed up beside him, dress catching on the splintered wood. The seat groaned under her weight. She folded her hands over her belly and stared straight ahead. The mules started forward with a lurch. Behind them, the yard faded the shouting, the smell, the eyes. Ahead lay nothing but miles of prairie, gray and endless. They rode without speaking. Wind whistled through the wagon boards, rattling the chain on the side. Clara watched the land pass brittle grass, fence posts leaning from years of storms, the occasional crow picking at the road. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You'll regret this shame." The word shame had followed her since childhood, through Sunday sermons, through whispered corners of town. But here, in this wide emptiness, it sounded smaller somehow. She turned slightly. Elias's profile was carved by the low, sun-strong jaw. Deep lines, a scar running from ear to chin. He held the reins loosely, as if the mules knew where to go without him. After a long while, she asked, barely audible, "Aren't you going to ask?" He glanced at her. "Ask who the father is? Why she sold me?" His eyes returned to the horizon. "Ain't my business." The simplicity stunned her. She looked away quickly, tears stinging her eyes. For the first time in months, she cried without hiding it. The tears cooled fast in the wind. As dusk settled, the land turned the color of rust. Shadows stretched long across the road. Elias guided the wagon up a narrow trail between low ridges. "Finally," he said, "you'll be safe where we're going." Clara's voice trembled. "Safe doesn't mean wanted." He didn't answer. When they reached the ridge, the first star broke through the purple sky. Ahead, a small cabin waited, smoke curling thin from its chimney. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop. "You can rest inside," he said. Clara stepped down slowly, boots sinking into the cold dirt. She turned to him, voice low. "I am not property." He met her eyes. "You ain't," he said softly. "Not to me." The mules shifted, stamping at the frost. A hawk cried somewhere high above, and for the first time in her life, Clara felt the wind move past her instead of through her. The prairie stretched wide and endless, the color of old bone. Each turn of the wagon wheel made a groan like something ancient remembering its age. Dust hung behind them, a slow ghost, refusing to fade. Elias Boone kept his eyes on the road ahead. The reins lay easy in his hands, thick as shovels, but steady, unhurried. He didn't glance her way, didn't speak, didn't fill the space with questions that had no mercy in their answers. Clara sat beside him, fingers twisted in her skirt. The wind tugged at loose strands of her hair, flinging them across her face. Every few minutes she stole a look at him, at the cut of his jaw, the quiet in his shoulders, the patience that felt less like peace and more like habit. She wondered if he pitied her, or if pity had no place in a man like that. The wagon hit a rut. She caught her breath, a hand flying to her stomach. The baby moved, faint but sure. Elias slowed the mules without a word. "You all right?" he asked finally. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the wind. "Yes," she said quickly, though her throat ached from saying it. Silence returned, long and clean. She tried to count the fence posts along the road, but there were too few to keep time. Her thoughts filled the emptiness. Instead, her mother's voice, sharp as winter glass. "You brought disgrace on this house, Clara Mayfield. You made your bed, now lie in it." She had lied in it, and the man who'd promised forever had risen before dawn, taken his coat, and never come back. She could still see him standing at the gate, that last morning, the preacher's son. Fine words and soft eyes. He'd touched her cheek, like something holy. Then he'd turned away when the town began to talk. "You understand? Clara, my father, the church, it can't." She had understood. Understanding didn't hurt less. It only made the hurt quieter. The mules kept their rhythm, heads bobbing, harness chains clinking in time with her pulse. She looked down at her hands chapped, raw around the nails. 6 months of hiding, then 3 days of pleading, then 1 morning of being sold. The land ahead rose and fell in slow waves. No trees, no sound but wind moving through dry grass. Every now and then, a hawk circled high, as if following them out of curiosity more than hunger. Elias reached for his canteen, took a drink, offered it wordlessly. She hesitated, then accepted. The water tasted like iron and cold tin, but it steadied her. "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded once, eyes still forward. The sun slid west, turning the horizon to brass. Shadows climbed the wagon wheels, long and bent. Her eyelids grew heavy, but she didn't dare sleep. Not yet. Not in front of him. They crossed a shallow creek where the ice hadn't fully set. The wheels splashed, water glittering in the dying light. On the far bank, the land opened again, scattered with the skeletons of cottonwoods tall, gray, half dead. Their branches reached upward like hands asking for something that never came. "That's my place," Elias said finally. She followed his gaze. Half a mile ahead stood a cabin 1 room, squared logs fitted tight, chimney leaning just enough to show it had survived more winters than comfort. Smoke curled from the stovepipe in thin ribbons. A corral sat empty beside it, gate hanging open. He guided the mules through the last stretch, wheels bumping over stone and frozen root. The air changed near the house, still cold, but carrying the scent of cedar and old ashes. When the wagon stopped, he climbed down first, boots crunching against the frost. He offered a hand, rough and warm. Clara hesitated, then took it. Her feet hit the ground with more force than grace, sending a shock up her spine. "You can go inside," he said. "Door sticks a bit. Just push." She stepped forward, pushing the door with her hip. It groaned open. Inside smelled of wood smoke, iron, and something faintly sweet cedar shavings, maybe. One room, only a small table, 2 chairs, a bed built into the far wall, an iron stove crouched in the corner, faint heat glowing behind its grate. Near the window stood a cradle, unfinished, one side missing, edges sanded smooth as if the maker couldn't quite stop himself from caring. Her chest tightened. Elias came in behind her, setting a lantern on the table. The flame threw soft gold across the room. He spoke quietly, almost to the floor. "You can have the couch." He pointed to a narrow piece of furniture near the wall. Its cushion faded but clean. "I'll take the floor." She turned to him. "You don't have to. I said I would." He interrupted, not harshly, just final. He reached for a folded blanket from the bed and placed it on the couch. Clara lowered herself slowly, hands clasped over her knees. The quiet pressed in, thick but not cruel. Elias moved around the room with measured steps. He hung his coat, stoked the stove, checked the latch on the window. Every sound he made was practical, unhurried. When he finished, he nodded toward the table. "There's stew left from last night. Eat if you want." Her stomach twisted between hunger and shame. "I'm fine." He gave no reply, just crossed to the far corner and spread a second blanket on the floorboards. The lamp flickered. The wind rattled the walls once, then fell still. She watched him lie down, boots off, arms crossed over his chest, face turned toward the ceiling. Within minutes, his breathing settled into the slow rhythm of a man who'd learned to rest anywhere. Clara sat a long time, eyes tracing the grain of the wood, the faint shimmer of firelight on the iron stove. The baby moved again, a small, stubborn life, insisting on being felt. She placed her palm over it and whispered, "We'll be all right." The words sounded strange in the air, like a promise she hadn't meant to make. She leaned back, closed her eyes. The quiet of the cabin wasn't like the silence she'd known before. That silence had been punishment doors slammed, prayers muttered, footsteps walking away. This was different. This silence breathed. It waited, not to judge, but to see what she would do next. Her thoughts drifted back to the marketplace, to her mother's face, set in iron, to the sound of coins and hooves, then to Elias Boone, sitting in the dark, saying nothing but meaning, more than anyone ever had. Somewhere outside, a coyote called across the valley. The wind shifted in the chimney, soft and low, like someone exhaling after holding breath too long. Clara opened her eyes once more, watching the shadows move along the wall. Fear still sat inside her, but beneath it, something unfamiliar began to stir, a fragile quiet that didn't come from giving up, but from finally being left in peace. Morning crept slow through the cracks in the log walls, a pale wash of light that turned dust motes into gold. Clara woke to the smell of food. For a moment, she didn't move, just lay there, wrapped in the rough wool blanket, listening. A pan hissed somewhere near the stove. The scent was unmistakable biscuits, eggs, maybe bacon. It pulled at her like a memory she didn't trust. She sat up carefully, Her body ached from the narrow couch, her back stiff, her feet swollen from the long ride. But the air in the cabin was warm, touched with the kind of heat that felt like kindness. On the table sat a plate, biscuits still steaming, golden on top, a slice of bacon laid neatly across. Beside it, a tin cup of milk and a folded napkin. No one had ever made her breakfast, not without demand or debt. Through the window, she could see him, Elias Boone, out near the woodpile, sleeves rolled to his elbows. Each swing of the axe was slow, deliberate, sure. The log, split clean, fell in two, and he lifted another without pause. His body moved like a part of the land itself, solid, unhurried, certain. Clara's stomach growled, loud enough to make her flush. She waited, half expecting him to come in and scold her for touching what wasn't hers. But he didn't. He just kept chopping, steady as a clock. She moved to the table and sat. For a moment, she only looked at the plate. Steam curled from the food like a quiet invitation. Her hands trembled when she picked up the biscuit. She took one bite. The crust cracked soft beneath her teeth, warm, buttery, real. Her eyes blurred. The tears came without sobs, just the quiet ache of someone who hadn't been fed without shame in a long, long time. They rolled down her cheeks and landed on the napkin, leaving small, dark marks. "Why would he feed me?" she whispered to no one. Outside, the axe struck wood again. Through the window, she watched him pause, not turning, just resting the blade against his knee for a heartbeat before swinging again. She wiped her face quickly, embarrassed by her own softness. The bacon cooled as she finished the biscuit, each bite smaller, slower. She drank half the milk, the sweetness coating her tongue. Then she folded the napkin neatly and placed it back on the plate, as though returning gratitude in the only way she knew. When the door creaked open, she froze. Elias stepped in, the cold clinging to his coat. He smelled of pine and sweat and something faintly metallic, like the earth after rain. He didn't look at her. He just set the axe by the door and poured water from a bucket into the basin. "Morning?" he said quietly. Clara hesitated, unsure how to answer something so ordinary. "Morning," she echoed, voice small. He nodded toward the stove. "You find the food?" "Yes." "Thank you." "Wasn't much. It was enough." He gave a faint nod and went back outside. Clara stood for a long while, the door swinging slightly in his wake. Her hands hovered over the table, unsure whether to clear it or leave it as it was. In the end, she wiped it clean, folded the napkin again, and placed it near the sink. That afternoon she swept the floor. The broom was heavy, bristles worn, but she worked slow and steady, careful not to disturb more than she had to. She found comfort in the rhythm, dust lifting, settling, the soft scrape of wood against wood. When she finished, she noticed something near the window, the cradle. Yesterday it had been missing one side plank, half built. Now the gap was filled, the rail fit smooth, sanded down, ready for the last coat of oil. She reached out, fingers brushing the wood. It was solid, made with hands that cared about more than function. Her throat tightened again. He hadn't asked about the baby, hadn't mentioned her belly, her past, her mother, just fixed the thing that would one day hold her child. She sat in the chair by the window, one hand resting on her stomach, the other tracing the grain of the wood. The wind shifted outside, rattling the thin glass panes. She looked out and saw him again, mending the fence this time, coat collar turned up against the cold. The sky above him stretched gray and wide. He looked small beneath it, small but steady. Clara's mind spun in quiet circles. What did he expect of me? Kindness always comes with a price. Her mother had taught her that lesson early. But here, no demands had come, no conditions, no preaching, only warmth, food, a fixed cradle. Her heart ached under the confusion. Was this mercy or pity? Was she safe, or simply trapped in a softer kind of cage? She pressed her palm against her belly again. The baby kicked. A faint flutter. A tear slipped down, not for sorrow this time, but for the strange tenderness of being seen without being spoken to. When evening came, the light outside turned amber. The cold deepened. Elias stacked wood by the door, his hands red from the chill. She opened her mouth once to offer thanks, but the words tangled again. After supper, simple bread and stew, they sat in quiet. He cleaned his tools. She mended a tear in her sleeve. The only sound was the steady tick of the stove expanding with heat. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He wasn't handsome in the way young men were, but there was something in the way he moved, deliberate, almost careful, that felt like safety itself. When he noticed her watching, she looked away, cheeks warm. Later, as he blew out the lamp, he said softly, "I'll be outside a while. Don't wait up." She nodded. All right. The door shut behind him. Darkness folded around the cabin, gentle as a blanket. Clara lay on the couch, hands folded over her stomach. The cradle stood by the window, a faint silhouette against the moonlight. She stared at it until her eyes blurred. Inside her, thoughts wrestled, two voices arguing softly in the dark. You belong to no one now. But what if belonging is the only way to be seen? The wind pressed against the walls, whispering through the cracks. Outside, she could hear the distant rhythm of an axe, slow and sure, like a heartbeat echoing across the land. And for the first time in years, Clara Mayfield drifted to sleep, not from exhaustion or defeat, but from something quieter, something almost like peace. Days passed without ceremony, one folding into another like pages no one hurried to turn. The prairie wind eased, frost melted on the porch railings by noon, and the smell of wood smoke mixed with something gentler coffee, bread, soap drying by the stove. Clara woke earlier now, not because Elias asked her to, but because the silence of morning invited her. It felt wrong to sleep through beauty that quiet. She would stir the fire, boil water, and watch the lights spread across the floorboards. Outside, the mules snorted and shook off the cold, and chickens called from the coop in clumsy chorus. Routine became rhythm. Elias didn't give orders, and she didn't seek them. They moved around each other the way people do when peace is still new and fragile. He fixed the barn door that had been leaning since before she came. She gathered eggs, careful not to break the fragile shells between her rough hands. He repaired a broken hinge. She swept the porch and scrubbed the table. No words of thanks. None were needed. Each act was a reply in a language older than speech. Sometimes, when she carried the feed bucket to the chickens, he would match her pace, slow and quiet. The birds swarmed their boots, pecking at the dust, feathers bright against the dull earth. Clara laughed once, startled by her own voice. It had been months since laughter found her. The sound startled her more than it did the birds. Elias looked up from where he stood, hammer resting against the fence post. That a laugh, he asked, half smiling. Think so, she said, cheeks pink. Well, he muttered, driving the nail home. Keep it. The simplicity of it left her smiling long after he'd gone back to work. The days slipped soft like that, measured by chores, not clocks. He replaced the worn cushion on her chair without mention. She noticed it the next morning, the new fabric smooth and bright. Later, the door stopped squealing when it opened. She never saw him oil the hinges, but she heard the difference. Then one morning, when the frost outside sparkled like spilled salt, she found something waiting on her seat. A shawl, knitted thick and uneven, threads of brown and gray woven with a single line of pale blue, the same color as the sky before dawn. She ran her fingers over it, feeling where the stitches pulled too tight, where they loosened again imperfection that made it real. Elias came in a moment later. Brushing snow from his coat, she looked up, holding the shawl like a question. "You make this?" He shrugged. "Had some yarn left over? Thought you might get cold by the window." Her throat tightened. "It's beautiful." He only nodded, hanging his hat on the wall. "Ain't perfect." "That's what makes it beautiful," she said softly. He didn't reply, just started the kettle, and she turned away before her eyes could betray her. Clara wore the shawl that evening. It smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. When the wind slipped through the cracks, she pulled it tighter around her shoulders and felt, for the first time in years, the comfort of being thought of. That night, while he worked on mending a wagon wheel, she sat by the table with needle and thread. Her stitches were crooked, her thread uneven, but she kept going. The cloth was small, plain cotton, once part of an old apron. She folded the corner and began to embroider a letter E. Her hands shook a little, not from cold, but from uncertainty. No one had ever told her that giving could be simple, that care didn't always demand return. The letter wasn't perfect. The lines wobbled, the thread knotted halfway through, but she tied it off and smiled anyway. When she finished, she folded it carefully and set it beside his tools on the workbench. No note, no words, just the gift. The next morning, the sun broke red and gold across the fields. Clara sat by the window, sipping weak coffee, wrapped in her shawl. Elias stepped outside to feed the mules. When he came back in, she noticed it immediately, the handkerchief tied around his wrist, the small E stitched on the corner, catching the light. He didn't mention it, didn't even glance her way. But the sight rooted something deep inside her, something that felt like a seed being planted in thawed soil. She looked down, hiding her smile in the rim of her cup. Maybe kindness wasn't pity. Maybe it was just kindness. The thought unsettled her, because kindness meant hope, and hope was a dangerous thing for someone who had learned to live without it. Later that day, while she hung herbs to dry near the stove yarrow, sage, and a handful of wild mint she'd gathered near the creek, she caught herself humming. The tune came unbidden, a melody her father used to whistle while fixing harnesses. The sound filled the cabin softly, and when she noticed, she stopped. Embarrassed, Elias, sanding a chair leg nearby, didn't look up. "Don't stop on my account," he said. "I didn't mean to," she murmured. "Still nice to hear." He said, voice low but sure. Something in his tone told her he wasn't talking about the song. The quiet that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was alive. She felt it in the scrape of his sandpaper, in the crackle of the stove, in the heartbeat that matched both. That evening, after supper, they sat by the fire. He carved small wooden pegs for the chair he was building. She watched the flames, shawl around her shoulders, mind caught between fear and something gentler. Could she forgive herself for wanting this? It felt like betrayal to crave comfort after everything that had been taken, to find warmth in a place where she had expected only survival. The thought made her chest ache. She turned toward the cradle by the wall, the one he'd finished repairing days ago. The light from the fire danced across its smooth rails. Her baby kicked once, strong and certain. Clara smiled through tears she didn't bother to hide. "I don't know what this is," she whispered to herself, "but maybe I don't have to fear it." Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, low and steady, as if agreeing, and in that quiet. Elias Boone kept carving, each curl of wood falling like a heartbeat between them, slow, patient, real. The wind came hard that afternoon, carrying the dry scent of storm from the west. The sky had turned the color of pewter, clouds low and restless. Clara was hanging laundry behind the cabin, her fingers numb from the cold. The sheets whipped against the line, snapping like sails. Elias was down by the corral, tightening a loose hinge. He worked steady as always, sleeves rolled, his hat pulled low. The only sound was the wind and the creak of rope until hooves broke the silence. A rider. The horse came fast up the road, throwing dust. The man atop it sat crooked in the saddle, hat tipped back, a grin stretched too wide. His coat was the color of old whiskey, his beard a week too long. Clara froze, one hand still gripping the wet sheet. The man slowed near the gate, leaning forward with the swagger of someone used to being unwelcome. "Well now," he drawled, "ain't this something? Thought the stories were just talk." Elias straightened, his hand falling from the hinge. He didn't move closer, just stood still, watching. The drifter's eyes found Clara. He tilted his head, lips curling. "So it's true. The giant took himself a sinner." He chuckled, looking her up and down. "Can't say I blame you. Boone. Girl like that's built for warmth, not for walkin'. But hell, look at her. Belly like a harvest moon. You feedin' her or fattenin' her?" Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The sound of the man's voice hit her, like a whip. Every word dragged her back to the marketplace, to the stairs, to her mother's scorn. Her breath hitched. She stepped back, hand over her stomach. Elias's voice cut through the wind. "You lost." The man turned, smirking, "Just looking for good company. Didn't know you were settling down," with he gestured toward Clara, laughing under his breath, with charity. Elias walked toward the fence, slow, deliberate. The air thickened. He stopped just a few feet away, eyes steady. "You've said enough." The man spat into the dirt. "Just speaking the truth. Friend, whole town knows what you took in. Woman like that ain't fit for." The sound came before the movement would, splitting, sharp and sudden. Elias's hand shot out. He gripped the top rail of the fence and wrenched. The board cracked free with a violent snap, the sound echoing through the empty yard. He dropped it at the man's boots. The thud was heavy, final. The drifter flinched. His grin faltered. Elias's voice was calm, low, and colder than the wind. "Truth ain't what comes from your mouth. It's what a man does when someone weaker stands in front of him." The rider shifted in his saddle, color rising in his face. "You threatening me?" Boone Elias took one slow step forward. The fence between them didn't matter anymore. "I'm telling you," he said evenly, "you've worn out your welcome." The man looked past him to Clara, his sneer returning in pieces. "Don't see why you care. She ain't worth it." Elias didn't blink. He leaned one arm against the fence, his size filling the space between Clara and the intruder. "No one talks to her like that," he said quietly. "Not here." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They hung in the air heavy as iron, and even the wind seemed to pause to hear them. The man's hand twitched near his belt, but he didn't draw. Instead, he laughed once, too loud, too brittle. Suit yourself. Boone, keep your pet, but don't cry when folks start talking. Elias didn't move. The drifter turned his horse, boots kicking dust. He spat once more into the dirt, missing the board at his feet by inches. Then he rode off, back toward the road, his laughter thinning with the distance. When the sound of hooves finally faded, silence filled the yard. Clara stood frozen beside the laundry line, one hand gripping the fabric so tight her knuckles ached. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths. Elias turned slowly, the storm still in his eyes but fading fast. He walked toward her, not close enough to frighten, but close enough for her to feel the steadiness of him. He spoke softly. "You all right?" She nodded, but her lip trembled. He hesitated, then reached out, his hand calloused, warm, sure rested on her shoulder. Not a claim, not control, just presence. Her breath hitched. "No one talks to you like that," he said again. "Not here." The words broke something inside her, not in pain, but in relief. Like a locked door swinging open for the first time in years, her throat burned. She tried to answer, but only a small sound escaped, half laugh, half sob. He didn't pull away, just left his hand there for a moment longer, grounding her to the earth beneath them. When he finally stepped back, she wiped her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. Embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" "For letting it get to me." He shook his head. "Ain't weakness to hurt. It's weakness not to stand when you can." She looked at him then, really looked the man who had bought her freedom with silence, who'd defended her dignity without shouting. And she realized she wasn't afraid of him. Not anymore. The wind shifted, carrying the first hint of rain. He picked up the broken board, set it against the fence, and said quietly, "Let's get the wash in before it hits. Together." They moved through the yard, the storm gathering over their heads. She worked beside him, folding the damp sheets, her hands still trembling, but lighter somehow. When the rain began to fall, soft and steady, they stood under the porch roof, watching it turn the earth dark. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The world around them was gray and alive, and for once, Clara didn't feel like she had to shrink to survive it. Tears still clung to her lashes, mixing with the rain that blew in sideways. But these tears weren't born of shame. They came from something deeper, something new. She turned to him, voice barely above the rain. "Thank you." Elias looked out at the horizon, water running down his hat brim. "Didn't do nothing special," he said. She smiled softly. "No, you did enough." And beside him, as thunder rolled over the plains, Clara Mayfield let the last of her fear wash away with the rain. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the world washed and still. Water dripped from the porch eaves in slow rhythm. Inside, the cabin smelled of wet earth and cooling ashes. Clara sat at the table, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching the steam rise from her cup of coffee. Elias was outside mending a fence rail, hammer echoing faint against the damp air. She should have felt at peace, but quiet, no matter how kind, has a way of stirring old ghosts. The sound of the hammer stopped. Moments later, the door opened, and Elias stepped in. He hung his coat on the hook, the smell of rain following him inside. "Fence'll hold," he said, setting his gloves on the table. She nodded, eyes still fixed on her cup. "Good." He looked at her for a moment, reading something in the stiffness of her shoulders. "You all right?" She hesitated, the word yes sitting on her tongue like a lie. "I'm fine," she said. Elias didn't move, just waited. Her eyes filled slowly, like a creek after rain. She pressed her fingers against them, angry at the weakness. "I hate that it still hurts," she whispered. He sat across from her, silent. She took a long breath. The words came slow, like they'd been waiting too long inside her. "It was a preacher's son," she said finally. "The father of my child." The name she didn't speak hovered between them like a ghost. "He said he loved me," she went on, "said God wouldn't mind if it was love, and I believed him. Fool that I was." Her hands twisted in the fabric of her dress. "When I told him about the baby, he went quiet, just quiet, and by morning he was gone." She laughed once, bitter and hollow, left a Bible on the porch, like that would save me. Elias didn't speak. He didn't flinch or fill the air with pity. He just listened. "My mother said I brought sin into the house," Clara continued. "She said the town would never forgive me, and maybe she was right. But she didn't forgive me either. Not once." The tears came again, hot and tired. I begged her to let me stay, to let me work off what I owed. She said I'd shamed her too deep for that. She sold me instead. The last words cracked. She covered her face, voice breaking through her fingers. I hated her for it. I still do, and I hate myself for missing her. The confession hung in the small room, heavy and human. Outside, a bird called from the wet trees, a sound too bright for the sadness in the air. Elias reached for the kettle, poured water into her empty cup, and set it down again. He didn't touch her. He didn't try to make it right. He just let her have the space to fall apart. After a long while, when her breathing eased, he spoke. "You ever tell anyone that before?" She shook her head. No one wanted to hear it. He nodded slowly. "Some stories hurt too much to fit in other people's ears." She looked at him then, eyes red but steady. "You ever lose someone?" Elias's gaze dropped to his hands. His thumb rubbed the scar along his palm, a habit she'd noticed but never asked about. "My brother," he said quietly. "Cattle stampede near the Yellowstone Trail. He was younger, smarter too." He gave a dry smile. Thought he could turn a herd on his own. The ground gave way under the front steers. Took him, and half the drive with it. Clara swallowed. "I'm sorry. Wasn't your doing," he said, then softer. "But it's strange how the things we couldn't stop keep hold of us longer than the things we chose." She watched him for a long moment. There was no grand grief in his tone, no trembling voice, just the simple weight of a man who'd carried loss long enough for it to become part of his shape. He leaned back, chair creaking under his weight. "I don't talk about him much," he said, "not 'cause I forget, but 'cause remembering don't change the ground." Clara nodded, understanding more in that one sentence than in all the sermons she'd ever heard. They sat like that for a while, two souls who'd been broken by different hands but shared the same quiet wound. The stove popped softly, the only sound in the room. She wiped the last of her tears. "You ever get tired of the silence?" Elias looked toward the window, where rain still dripped from the eaves. "Sometimes," he said. "But I'd rather a silence that's honest than words that ain't." She smiled faintly. "Then I suppose we make a good pair." He met her eyes, and something unspoken passed between them, understanding, respect, the kind of recognition that doesn't need language. Outside, the clouds began to break. Light fell in through the window, soft and uncertain. It brushed across the table, warming her hands, glinting on the edge of his coffee cup. Clara exhaled. The breath came deep and clean, like she'd been holding it since the day her mother sold her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what? For not saying I'm foolish." "You're not," he replied. "You're just someone who's still here." The words settled over her like a blanket, simple, steady, true. She looked down, tracing the grain of the table with her finger. Her reflection flickered in the cup, tired but alive. "I thought silence was punishment," she whispered. "Turns out, maybe it's where I can finally rest." Elias nodded once, leaning back in his chair, gaze steady on the window where light met rain. "Sometimes silence means safety," he said. "Sometimes it's the only thing that listens right." Clara smiled, then small, trembling, real. For the first time since her father's songs faded from memory, she didn't feel the need to fill the air. The quiet between them wasn't empty anymore. It was a place to breathe, a place to heal. And as the sun slipped out from behind the clouds, lighting the wet land in gold, Clara Mayfield understood that some truths aren't meant to be shouted. They're meant to be shared in the hush between two people who've both learned how to survive. The wind changed first. It came low from the east, carrying dust that shimmered faintly under a pale sun. Clara was near the porch, washing the last of the morning dishes in a tin basin. The day had been calm until the mules lifted their heads and the chickens scattered, restless. She looked up. Far down the road, a small cloud of dust rose behind a wagon. Two riders flanked it, one in a dark coat, the other wearing the badge of the Dakota deputy. And in the wagon seat sat a woman she hadn't seen since the day she was traded for a horse, Agnes Mayfield. The world seemed to tilt. The basin slipped in Clara's hands, water splashing across her skirt. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. Elias stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He followed her gaze. His jaw tightened, though his voice stayed calm. "You know him." Clara nodded once. "My mother." The word tasted like iron. Elias's face didn't change, but his eyes sharpened, scanning the approaching wagon. He moved to the porch rail, resting one hand on the post. "Go inside," he said quietly. She wanted to argue, but the sound of the wagon wheels drowned her voice. The wooden spokes groaned over the rocks, the horses blowing white breath. So she went inside, but she didn't close the door. Through the thin curtain, she watched them stop just beyond the gate. Agnes climbed down first, her black skirt stiff, her gray hair coiled tight under a bonnet. She looked older, leaner, but her eyes still carried that same hard shine, like glass that cut even in sunlight. Beside her, the town preacher adjusted his collar, discomfort already creasing his brow. The deputy stayed mounted, hat brim low. Elias didn't step forward to greet them. He stood still, broad and unmoving, a wall between the cabin and the road. Agnes's voice cracked the air like a whip. "Mr. Boone, I'm here for my daughter." Elias's gaze didn't flicker. "You traded her. I bartered her safety." Agnes snapped. "There's a difference." He folded his arms, slow and deliberate. "Didn't sound like safety that day." Agnes's jaw clenched. "I did what I had to. You have no claim on her." Elias's tone stayed even. "I never said I did." The preacher cleared his throat, voice tight. "This situation's improper. A woman, unwed, living with a man not her kin. It's caused talk." Elias's eyes didn't leave Agnes. "What does Clara want?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. Agnes blinked. "She doesn't know what she wants. She's—" But she didn't finish, because Clara had stepped out onto the porch. Her hands trembled, but her chin was high. The shawl Elias had made for her lay over her shoulders, her belly full and round beneath her dress. "Mama," she said quietly. Agnes turned, startled by the sound of that word. "Don't you mama me, girl," she hissed. "You're coming home." Clara took a step down the porch stairs. Her bare feet pressed into the cold dirt. The wind pulled at her hair. "I'm not," she said simply. The preacher's eyes darted between them, uncertain whether to interfere. Agnes's face hardened. "You've embarrassed this family enough. You'll give birth under a proper roof, not in some stranger's shack." Clara's voice trembled once, but didn't break. "You sold me like livestock." Agnes's mouth opened, ready to protest, but Clara's words came sharper, louder now. "You bartered me for a dying horse." "Mama, don't you dare talk about what's proper." The preacher shifted awkwardly. The deputy looked away. Agnes's cheeks flushed red, her voice rising. "I did what was necessary. You would have ruined us. Ruined me." Clara stood still, eyes shining but steady. "I was never yours to sell." The words fell like stones, final and true. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then the preacher turned toward his reins, clearing his throat again. "Perhaps, Mrs. Mayfield," we should. Agnes cut him off with a gesture, voice trembling with rage. "You think this will end well. You think shame just disappears because you hide it in a cabin." Elias's voice came quiet but unshakable. "She's not hiding." Agnes spun toward him. "And you, what are you? Some savior, some fool thinking you can wash her clean." He didn't rise to it. He only said, "She belongs where she's safe." The deputy shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he muttered, "maybe it's best we head back." But Agnes ignored him. She stared at Clara, eyes burning with something colder than hate, something like loss. "You'll regret this shame," she said finally. Clara drew a slow breath. Her voice was soft, but carried like wind through tall grass. "This is the first choice I ever made." Agnes's lips parted, but no sound came. Her eyes flicked once toward the preacher, then to the deputy, as if searching for someone to share her righteousness. Neither met her gaze. She turned sharply, skirts whipping dust from the ground. "Let's go," she said, climbing back into the wagon. The horses started forward. The wheels cracked against the stones. The preacher gave a hesitant nod toward Clara, then followed in silence. The deputy lingered a moment longer, hat in hand. He looked at Elias, then at Clara. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you take care now." She nodded, unable to find words. When the wagon vanished beyond the ridge, only the wind remained steady, unjudging. It carried the last trace of her mother's perfume and the dry sting of dust, then swept both away. Clara stood there, trembling from the inside out. Elias came down the porch steps, stopping beside her. "You did that," he said. She nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I finally said it. You can say it again, if you need." She turned to him, tears glinting but unshed. "I don't need to," she whispered. She heard me. For a long while, they stood side by side, the wind wrapping around them, sharp but clean. Clara's heart still hammered, but the fear was gone. What replaced it was something unfamiliar and fierce, like standing barefoot on solid ground after years of sinking. She looked toward the cabin, smoke curling gently from the chimney. Her home. Behind her, the last of the wagon's dust drifted away, disappearing into the vast Dakota sky. And in that silence, Clara Mayfield felt what freedom truly sounded like, not applause, not forgiveness, just the quiet, where judgment used to be. The first thunder rolled low over the hills, a deep growl that shook the windows in their frames. Clara woke to it, heart pounding, breath short. The air in the cabin felt thick, charged. Rain lashed the roof like handfuls of gravel. The wind screamed through the chimney, dragging smoke in tight spirals. Elias was already up. He'd felt the storm coming since dusk, the change in the wind. The way the horses shifted in their stalls, uneasy. Now he moved through the cabin with quiet urgency, lighting the lantern, checking the shutters. Then he heard it, a sound not made by thunder. A sharp breath, a broken whisper. Elias. He turned. Clara stood by the bed, one hand gripping the post, the other pressed to her stomach. Her face was pale, her body tense. "It's time," she said, voice trembling. For a moment, the world went still. Then lightning split the sky open, and the rain came harder. Elias crossed the room in 2 strides. "You sure?" She nodded, biting back a cry. "I can't. I don't." He caught her arm, steadying her. "You can... sit down." He pulled the extra blankets from the shelf, spread them over the bed, then moved to the hearth, stoking the fire higher until the room glowed red and gold. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, every shadow flickered with light and fear. Clara doubled over, the first real wave hitting her like a fist from the inside. She gasped, gripping the edge of the mattress. "Breathe," he said softly, voice steady over the chaos. She tried, failed, tried again. The pain clawed up her spine, raw and merciless. "I can't do this," she cried, tears mixing with sweat. Elias knelt beside her, hand on her back. "You already are." Lightning flashed again, white and blinding. The lantern swayed on its hook, casting their shadows long against the wall, 2 figures fighting through darkness together. Another contraction came, stronger. Her scream rose and broke. The wind outside matched it, tearing through the cottonwoods like a wild animal. The storm and her pain became one sound thunder and heartbeat, fear and life all tangled together. Elias moved with quiet precision. He fetched water, laid out clean cloth, tore one into strips. His face stayed calm, his hands sure. She watched him through half-closed eyes, breath ragged. "Why are you so calm?" He wrung out a cloth, placed it against her forehead. "Because one of us needs to be..." She laughed once, weak and wet with tears. "You think you can fix this with calm?" He smiled faintly. "Never fixed a storm. Just ride it out." Another contraction tore through her. She cried out, the sound raw enough to shake the rafters. Her mind splintered. Voices rose inside her, her mother's, sharp and cruel. "You've brought shame. You're nothing but trouble. You'll regret this." Each word struck like lightning. Each one burned into her chest. Then came his voice, Elias's, cutting through the noise like steady rain over fire. "Breathe, Clara. You're here?" She did. The next pain hit, and she bore down, her fingers clutching his sleeve. He stayed anchored, unflinching, his hand braced against the small of her back. Outside, thunder crashed so close it rattled the stove. The mules screamed in the barn. "You're all right," he whispered, leaning close. "Look at me." She met his eyes. For the first time, she saw no pity, no fear, only faith. The next wave came and broke. Her world narrowed to breath, to pain, to the sound of his voice, pulling her through the storm. "Breathe. That's it. You're stronger than this." She screamed again, raw and real, but it wasn't a scream of defeat. It was release. Then came a silence between thunderclaps, wide and heavy, and in that breath, between agony and exhaustion, she felt something shift. Her body bore down once more, then everything inside her released. A cry, tiny, furious, alive. Clara collapsed back, chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. Elias caught the small, slippery weight in his hands, wrapped it in a cloth, and stared for a moment as though he didn't quite believe what he was holding. He turned to her, voice breaking for the first time. "She's here." He placed the baby in Clara's arms. The storm still roared outside, but inside, everything went quiet. The little one's cry softened into hiccups, her fists clenched, eyes closed tight, breath warm against Clara's chest. Clara looked down, wonder fighting with exhaustion. "She's beautiful," she whispered. Elias sat beside the bed, wiping the sweat from Clara's temple with the back of his hand. "She's proof," he said softly. Clara blinked. "Proof that you lived through it," he said. "That you fought." She let out a small, broken laugh, her tears mixing with rain leaking through the roof. The wind outside began to fade. The thunder rolled further away, echoing down the valley like a slow drumbeat. Clara traced the baby's tiny fingers, each one perfect, impossibly small. Her heart ached not with fear this time, but with something she didn't yet know how to name: love, maybe, or peace. Elias stood and tossed another log onto the fire. "You rest now," he said, voice quiet again. Clara nodded, still staring at her daughter. The storm light flickered across the room, painting the walls gold. As she drifted toward sleep, she whispered, "She's not born from shame, is she?" Elias paused at the door, looking back at her. "No," he said. "She's born from choice, from fight, from you." The rain slowed to a gentle patter on the roof. The lantern flickered once, then steadied. And in that small, cedar-scented cabin, surrounded by the last murmurs of thunder, Clara Mayfield held her child close and realized that for the first time in her life, the storm outside didn't scare her anymore. The rain softened by morning, falling in thin silver threads. The storm had spent itself, leaving the air washed clean and the earth dark and shining. Inside the cabin, everything smelled of wet wood, smoke, and something new, something alive. Clara lay back against the pillows, her skin damp, her body trembling from the long hours before. The world outside still whispered with the memory of thunder. But in here, only quiet remained. The baby's cry, that first wild sound of life, had faded into small sighs. Now she lay wrapped in cloth, warm and pink, her tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Clara watched her daughter's fingers twitch against the blanket, impossibly small, impossibly real. Elias sat nearby, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire as though it might explain what had just happened. His shirt was soaked through, hair clinging to his temples. He looked like a man who'd wrestled both heaven and hell and found peace somewhere between. Clara's voice came soft, cracked from hours of strain. "She's quiet now." Elias turned, eyes gentler than she'd ever seen them. "Means she's strong." He stood, walked to the table, poured water into a cup, and held it out to her. "Here, small sips." She drank, the water tasting of metal and earth and mercy. When she finished, her hand lingered around the cup. Her gaze drifted to the cradle by the window, the same one he'd built weeks ago. It was ready now, every board smooth, every joint firm. "I never thought I'd see her," Clara whispered. "I used to think I'd never see anything past shame." Elias looked down at the baby in her arms, then at her. "She's proof you lived," he said softly, "that you fought." Clara's eyes filled, not with sorrow, but with something fierce and clean. She looked at her daughter, really looked, tiny nose, wrinkled fists, a mouth shaped like determination itself. "She's beautiful," Clara breathed. She's yours, Elias said, voice steady, reverent. Clara smiled through tears. She's ours, she corrected gently. He blinked, surprised, but didn't argue. He only nodded once, as if accepting something deeper than words. Outside. A break of light pushed through the clouds, spilling gold across the wet grass. It caught the steam from the roof and turned it into a faint, rising mist. The baby stirred, fussing a little. Clara shifted her, rocking slow. Shh, she whispered. You're safe now. The words weren't just for the child. They were for every younger version of herself the girl dragged through the marketplace, the one who cried in barns and begged for forgiveness she didn't owe. They were for the woman who had survived being forgotten. Elias moved quietly, tending the fire, setting the kettle back on its hook. He didn't fill the silence, he just let it breathe, the way he always did. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. Her mind flashed back the cold morning she'd been sold, the whispers, her mother's hand clamped around her wrist. It all came rushing, sharp as glass, and then faded, softening under the sound of her daughter's breathing. She realized, slowly, that those memories no longer owned her. They were still there, but they'd lost their teeth. The rain outside thinned to a hush. Drops slid down the window pane, catching the light like tiny stars. Elias crouched near the cradle, adjusting the blankets. He ran a hand along the smooth edge of the wood. I wasn't sure I'd finish this in time, he said quietly. Clara smiled, exhaustion heavy in her voice. You did? You always do? He gave a small nod, the kind that said you're welcome without needing words. For a long time, neither spoke. Only the sounds of the fire and the gentle rhythm of new breath filled the room. Clara traced the baby's cheek with her thumb. She doesn't know the world yet, she murmured. She doesn't know what it can take. Then maybe she'll teach it something different, Elias said. Clara looked up at him, surprised by the softness in his tone. Like what? That sometimes love ain't loud, he said. Sometimes it's just showing up and staying put. Her lips trembled into a smile. You think she'll remember that? He shrugged. You will. That's enough. The fire popped, sending a spark up the flue. Outside, a lone bird began to call, hesitant, as if testing whether the storm was truly gone. Clara shifted, wincing, but her smile didn't fade. The pain was still there, sharp in her hips, heavy in her bones, yet it felt different now. Purpose had replaced punishment. This hurts, she said softly. Elias met her gaze. Means you're healing. She looked down again at the baby, at the tiny life that had come through the same storm she had. The child yawned, eyes fluttering open for a heartbeat, a flash of blue-gray, just like the morning sky after rain. Clara gasped, breath catching in wonder. She opened her eyes. Elias smiled faintly. She's looking for you. Clara pressed her lips to the baby's forehead. The scent of milk, sweat, and life filled her lungs. A sound escaped her, a soft, unguarded sob. Not grief, not regret. Release. I didn't think I deserved this, she whispered. Elias's voice was low, certain. You earned it, Clara, every bit of it. She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. Outside, the drizzle eased, the last drops falling light as breath. The storm had ended, and with it, the woman who'd been sold for shame was gone. What remained was someone new, raw, tired, strong, a mother. Clara held her daughter closer, feeling the small heartbeat against her chest, steady as sunrise. Welcome home, she whispered. The baby stirred, curling into her warmth. Elias stood at the window, watching the clouds lift over the hills. The land was quiet now, washed clean. He turned back toward them, mother and child, framed in the soft morning light, and something in his chest eased too. No more storms, just the hum of peace that follows when everything finally finds its place. Rumors travel faster than wind on the plains. By spring, the story had already outpaced the wagons and riders that crossed Rust Creek. They say that Mayfield girl's still alive. Folks whispered. The one who was traded for a horse. A chuckle here, a murmur there. Some swore she'd gone mad in the hills. Others said she'd died giving birth. But when the thaw came and the roads dried, truth rode straight through the center of town in the shape of a wagon with two steady wheels, a giant man at the reins, and a woman sitting beside him, her shawl fluttering like a banner in the morning light. Clara Mayfield had come to town. Her daughter was swaddled in her arms, sleeping against her breast. The townsfolk stared, some pretending not to, others bold enough to let their eyes follow. It had been nearly a year since the day Agnes Mayfield dragged her through this same street. Head bowed, cheeks burning with shame, now the same woman walked those boards barefoot, her chin lifted, her gait slow but steady. Elias Boone guided the horse to the post outside the general store. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The sound of the reins, the creak of the leather, that was enough to quiet even the loudest whispers. The blacksmith paused mid-swing, his hammer hanging in the air. The grocer's wife leaned out the doorway. Lips parted in surprise, Clara stepped down from the wagon, holding her baby close. The shawl Elias had knitted was wrapped around both of them. Threads of soft green and brown colors of new life and old earth. She met the eyes of a woman sweeping her porch, the same woman who'd once spat near her feet. Now that broom just froze mid-air, guilt flickering in her gaze. Clara offered a nod. Nothing more. That small gesture felt heavier than any sermon. Inside the general store, the air smelled of sawdust and soap, shelves lined with flour, nails, bolts of fabric, everything neatly in its place. The owner, Mr. Harlan, looked up from behind the counter. His face twitched with the urge to say something, then softened. "Well, Miss Mayfield," he said finally, tipping his hat. "Ain't seen you in a long while." She smiled, slow and calm. "Mrs. Actually," she said, "at least that's what folks can call me if they need to." Harlan's eyes flicked to Elias, who stood by the door, hat low, silent as ever. Then back to her. "Right," he murmured. "Well, what can I get you? Flour? Sugar? Some cloth if you have it?" Her voice was steady, gentle, but carried across the room like music. Not proud, not defiant, simply present. As she waited, she felt the eyes on her, the widow by the stove, the two young men pretending to inspect nails, the preacher's wife in the corner aisle, all of them watching, all of them whispering behind the weight of their own guilt. She ignored them. She looked down at her baby instead, tracing one small hand with her finger. The little girl stirred and opened her eyes, that same gray-blue, like a storm, easing off the hills. Clara smiled. "Don't mind them," she whispered. "Let 'em look. Let 'em learn." Harlan wrapped her goods in brown paper, tied it with twine. "You all right for coin?" Elias stepped forward, setting payment on the counter without a word. The shopkeeper hesitated, then nodded. "You folks take care now?" As they turned to leave, Clara heard someone whisper near the back, "Is it true she gave birth in his cabin?" Another voice answered, quieter, "Does it matter outside?" The street shimmered with light, The wind carried the smell of sage and horses. Every sound felt cleaner somehow, as if the storm that had nearly killed her had washed the whole world along with it. They passed the livery, where an old ranch hand leaned on the fence rail. He tipped his hat to her. "Good morning, ma'am." Clara blinked. It was the same man who'd once laughed when her mother called her worthless. Now his voice held no mockery, only respect. She nodded in return. "Morning." Elias helped her back onto the wagon. The baby shifted in her arms, cooing softly. As they rolled out of town, Clara looked back once. The faces behind them had changed, not in feature, but in tone. Mockery had turned to curiosity, and curiosity had given way to something quieter. Respect doesn't always speak aloud. Sometimes it just stops throwing stones. Elias glanced her way. "You did good." She smiled faintly. "I just bought sugar. Wasn't what I meant." "I know," she said, eyes on the horizon. "But sometimes normal's the bravest thing you can do." He chuckled once, a sound like gravel rolling smooth. "Guess so." They rode in silence for a while, the wagon creaking over the dirt road. The baby's small breaths blended with the rhythm of the wheels. Clara's gaze drifted over the land, wide, open, alive. The cottonwoods had begun to green again, their leaves trembling in the breeze. She thought of her mother's face, of that last glare of bitterness. For the first time, the memory didn't hurt. It just existed, distant, like an old scar that no longer burned. "Let them whisper," she said softly. Elias looked over. "What's that?" She smiled. "Let them whisper. I've already spoken." The wagon rolled on, slow and steady. Behind them, the town shrank to a handful of roofs and a bell tower that caught the sun. Ahead, the prairie opened wide, stretching toward a horizon that finally felt like hers. The baby yawned, tiny mouth curling. Clara bent down and kissed her forehead. The child stirred, then settled, her small body safe against her mother's chest. Elias adjusted the reins, eyes on the road ahead. Home by sundown. "Home?" Clara echoed. The word felt different now, not like a place she'd been given, but one she'd chosen. And as Rust Creek faded behind them, the whispers followed softer now, fading into the sound of wind and wheel. They would tell their stories, twist the truth, trade the tale over whiskey and bread. But it didn't matter, because the only truth that counted sat right beside her breathing, living, proof that shame could turn into strength if you just stayed long enough to outlast it. The world went on spinning, the way it always does. But, for Clara Mayfield, it was the first time she'd felt it spin around her, not over her. Spring came slow that year, the kind of spring that doesn't announce itself, just seeps in blade by blade, bird by bird. The cottonwoods behind the cabin were full again, their new leaves trembling like small coins in the breeze. The air smelled of wet soil and sunlight. You could almost hear the thaw, the sound of ground loosening, of rivers remembering how to run. Clara stood on the porch, her daughter cradled in her arms. The baby's laugh, bright and sudden, rose above the hum of bees. Elias was by the fence, hammering a new post into place. Each strike of his mallet was measured, deliberate. Like a heartbeat, the land had learned to trust. Clara smiled. He'd been fixing that same stretch of fence for 3 days. Not because it needed it, but because he liked how it looked when it was straight. The child giggled again, reaching for the edge of her mother's shawl. "You like watching him too, don't you?" Clara whispered. "He's a good man." The baby made a small coo, as if agreeing. Elias set the hammer down and wiped his hands on his trousers. When he looked up, She was already walking toward him, slow, barefoot through the damp grass. The wind brushed her hair loose, and for a moment, Elias just stood there, watching. He'd seen her every day for months, yet somehow she looked new each time, not from change, but from peace. "You're up early," he said. "So are you," she replied. He nodded toward the field. "Fence don't build itself." She smiled. "A quiet thing. Doesn't seem to stop you from trying." He grinned faintly. "Fair." For a while, they just stood there, listening to the rustle of the trees and the soft creak of the wood in the wind. Then Clara said, "Let's take a walk." He looked toward the wagon. "You want to go into town?" She shook her head. "No. Just here." They walked beyond the fence line, where the grass grew tall and soft. The sky stretched wide, the kind of blue that made you believe in forgiveness. At the edge of the field stood an old cottonwood, older than either of them could guess. Its bark was rough, its trunk split by lightning long ago. Yet it still stood strong, new branches reaching upward. Clara stopped beneath it. "This tree's seen more than most preachers," she said softly. Elias chuckled. "Likely tells better stories, too." She laughed the sound light, unguarded. Then, after a pause, she said, "I don't need a preacher." He looked at her, then truly looked. There was something in her eyes, not fear, not uncertainty, but quiet resolve. Clara shifted the baby in her arms. "I just need this," she said, glancing between him and the child. The wind moved through the cottonwood, setting its leaves, whispering above them, like the hush of 1,000 small prayers. Elias took a slow breath. "You sure?" She nodded. "I don't need a crowd to tell me what I already know." He stepped closer. His shadow fell across hers, their outlines merging in the grass. The baby reached toward him, tiny fingers curling in the air. Elias smiled and brushed one with his fingertip. "Guess she approves." Clara looked down at her daughter. "She's the only witness we need." For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Elias said, "All right." He reached out, taking her free hand in his rough palm, warm grip. "I don't have fancy words," he said. "Never been good with them. I don't want fancy." She whispered, "I just want true." He nodded. His voice came quiet but steady. "I see you. Clara Mayfield. Every scar, every strength. And I'll spend what life I've got making sure no one ever takes that from you again." Her breath trembled. She squeezed his hand. "And I believe you, Elias Boone. I believe in what you are, steady, kind, and real. That's more than I ever asked the world for." The wind lifted then, sweeping through the grass, through their hair, through the leaves above. It felt like something bigger than a blessing, something older. Elias leaned forward, slow and certain, and kissed her. Not hard, not rushed, just long enough for the world to hold its breath. The baby laughed, a small bright sound that cut through the stillness. Elias pulled back, grinning. "Guess that's our amen?" Clara laughed softly, her eyes shining. "I'll take it." They stood beneath the cottonwood for a while, the three of them framed in the light. The world didn't change, the wind didn't pause, the birds didn't stop, but somehow everything felt new anyway. Elias took the baby gently, resting her against his arm. She blinked up at him, yawned, and curled her tiny fingers around his thumb. "Strong grip," he said. "Like her mama." Clara smiled. "She'll need it." They started back toward the cabin, walking slow. Each step sank into the soft earth, the sound of their feet mixing with the rhythm of the wind. Halfway there, Clara stopped and looked back at the cottonwood. Sunlight filtered through its leaves, turning them gold. "That's where we'll tell her," she said, "when she's old enough to ask how we met." Elias followed her gaze. "You think she'll understand? She won't have to," Clara said. "She'll feel it." He nodded, thoughtful. Maybe that's how love works, best quiet enough, to be felt before it's spoken. She smiled. "Then we'll do just fine." The baby sighed, nestling deeper into the crook of his arm. The cabin came into view, smoke rising thin and blue from the chimney. Garden beginning to sprout by the fence. Everything simple, everything enough. Clara reached for his hand again as they walked. The wind brushed past, cool and alive. Carrying with it the soft rustle of leaves, a promise whispered between sky and earth, and under that wide Dakota sky, where no one but the land bore witness. Clara Mayfield and Elias Boone made a vow not bound by law or paper, but by truth, and by choice, and by the quiet miracle of having survived long enough to find one another. The years passed like the seasons slow, sure, and full of small mercies. Rust Creek changed too. The trails grew busier, the telegraph lines reached farther, and the dust that once meant loneliness now meant movement, trade, life. But out past the edge of town, where the cottonwoods still whispered to the wind, there stood a ranch built by quiet hands, the Boone place. It wasn't grand. It wasn't meant to be. But the fence lines were straight, the barn roof was tight, and the fields held more green than they ever had before. A swing hung from the big cottonwood now. Its ropes creaked gently as a little girl 6 years old, hair wild as prairie grass, kicked her bare feet toward the clouds. Higher. "Mama," she called. Clara laughed, pushing the swing from behind. Her hair, streaked with sun, had grown long again. She wore the same shawl Elias had made all those years ago, though it was patched and frayed at the edges. "Hold tight, sweetheart," she said, smiling. The girl shrieked with laughter as she swung higher, her joy scattering across the field like birds startled into flight. Elias stood by the porch, watching. His arms crossed loosely. Time had added gray to his beard, but his shoulders were still broad, his eyes still steady. He caught Clara's gaze and gave her that same small, knowing smile he always did, the kind that said, "We made it." When the swing slowed, Clara lifted her daughter off and set her on the grass. "Go show your papa what you found," she said. The little girl ran toward the porch, clutching a small bouquet of bluebells. Elias knelt to meet her, his laugh low and warm. "Look at that," he said, tucking one flower behind her ear. "Prettiest thing I ever saw next to your mama." Clara rolled her eyes, but the smile stayed. Later, when the chores were done and the sun dipped low, painting the land in honey and amber, Clara sat on the porch steps. The swing rocked softly in the breeze, the child's laughter fading into the hum of crickets. Elias joined her, setting 2 cups of coffee down, one steaming, one already cooling. They sat without words, watching the light fade. After a while, Clara spoke not to him exactly, but to the air, the earth, maybe even to whoever might one day listen. "They said shame would bury me," she murmured, "but here I am, planting roots." The wind lifted the edges of her shawl, carrying her words into the tall grass. "I used to think life was something that happened to me," she said softly. "Now I know it's something you build, one fence post, one sunrise, one breath at a time." Elias reached over and took her hand. His fingers were still calloused, still strong. "You built plenty," he said. Clara smiled. eyes glistening in the dim light, not alone. He gave a small nod, never alone. The door creaked open. Their daughter appeared, rubbing her eyes, dragging her father's old coat like a blanket. "Mama," she yawned. "Can I sleep outside tonight? The stars are out." Clara chuckled. "Not tonight. Baby, too many coyotes would want to share your blanket." The girl giggled, then climbed into her father's lap. He wrapped the coat around her, resting his chin on her hair. Clara watched them, her heart full in that quiet way that comes only after loss has done its teaching. She thought of the woman she used to be, the frightened girl dragged through the market, the one who thought she'd been traded away from love forever. That woman was gone now, but she still lived somewhere, deep inside, softened, forgiven. The cradle Elias had built still stood by the wall inside the cabin, though it had long since been emptied. Now it held toys, a wooden horse, a faded doll, a piece of blue ribbon from a county fair. Sometimes, Clara would run her hand along its edge and remember the night the storm came, the pain, the fear, the moment when she thought she couldn't go on, and the voice that told her she already was. The memory didn't hurt anymore. It felt like a story that belonged to someone she once knew, a girl who had finally made it home. The sky deepened, stars blinking to life one by one. Crickets sang in the grass, and the wind carried the scent of sage and wood smoke. Clara leaned her head against Elias's shoulder. He shifted slightly, careful not to wake the little one now asleep in his arms. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not once." She smiled. "Me neither." The silence between them was easy now, the kind that speaks more than words. In the distance, a coyote howled, long and low, answered by another across the hills. The sound didn't scare her anymore. It just reminded her how alive the world was. She closed her eyes, breathing in the cool night air. "Elias, thank you." "For what?" "For staying." He looked down at her, his smile small but full. Wasn't a hard thing to do. The stars shimmered above them, countless and close. Clara spoke again, voice soft, meant for whoever might be listening, maybe the wind, maybe the hearts of women who'd been told they were too much or not enough. "No woman is too broken to be loved," she said, "no story too heavy to be carried home." The wind moved gently through the cottonwoods, like an answer. The porch lantern flickered, casting their shadows long across the grass, three shapes, joined together. And as the night settled around them, warm and steady, Clara Mayfield closed her eyes and smiled. Home wasn't something she'd found. It was something she had built piece by piece, breath by breath, until even the ghosts knew to rest. Clara's story reminds us that shame only has power when we believe it belongs to us. For years, she carried the weight of others' judgment, her mother's cruelty, the town's whispers, the lie that her worth was something to be traded or measured. But through kindness, through the steady patience of one good man, she learned the hardest truth of all, that love is not something we earn, it's something we allow ourselves to receive. Life in the West was never gentle. It carved deep lines in faces and hearts alike. Yet even in a world built on dust and survival, compassion could bloom where no one expected it. Elias didn't save Clara. He simply saw her. And in that, she found the strength to save herself. Maybe that's the lesson we all need, to remember that healing doesn't shout, and dignity doesn't ask permission. No matter how late the hour or how heavy the past, there's still room to plant something new. And sometimes, all it takes is one quiet act of respect to turn a life of shame into a home built from love. Thank you friends, for riding along with us through the winds of Rust Creek and the life of Clara Mayfield. If her story touched your heart, if it reminded you that kindness still has a place in this rough old world, we'd be mighty grateful if you'd help us keep these stories alive. Hit that like button. Share this tale with someone who believes in second chances. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Echoes for more forgotten stories of courage, love, and redemption. Till next time, stay wild, stay warm, and keep your lantern lit.